I still hear her voice like a knife in my chest. I want a real man, not you. After selling everything I owned to save her life, Clara walked away with another man and took my children with her. That betrayal didn't just break me, it hollowed me out. My name is Ethan Hayes, and this is the story of how the woman I sacrificed everything for turned me into nothing until the truth forced its way back into the light. The mornings in our house always started with the sound of chatter, the smell of toast, and the rhythm of a routine that felt unshakable. Clara stood by the stove, humming softly as she scrambled eggs, her dark hair tucked behind one ear. Across the table, Noah leaned over his basketball playbook, mouthing plays as if the championship game depended on him getting every detail right. Emily sat straighter than anyone her age should, her violin case propped against the wall beside her chair. Hands folded neatly as she waited for breakfast. I would sip my coffee and look around the kitchen with a quiet pride. The walls, the cabinets, the very bones of this house. I had built them. Every corner carried a memory, from the first Christmas tree we'd set up in the living room to the pencil marks still faintly visible on the doorway, showing how much taller the kids had grown each year. After breakfast, I drove Noah to practice, his basketball bouncing in the back seat with each turn, while Emily chattered about her upcoming recital. She practiced tirelessly, determined to earn her spot at the spring concert. When I dropped her off at school, she gave me that little nod she always did, half reassurance, half challenge, as if daring me not to miss it. Evenings were Clara's time. After dinner, she sat at the piano, letting melodies pour through the house while the kids bickered gently over homework at the table. Those nights, I'd stand in the doorway, feeling like life couldn't possibly get any better. But in the middle of that harmony, shadows crept in. Clara had started to press a hand to her stomach now and then, her smile faltering for just a second before she caught herself. When I asked, she brushed it off with a light laugh. Just a little tired. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Looking back, I realized those were the first cracks in the picture I thought would last forever. The day began like any other, but it ended with a weight that nearly crushed me. Clara had been more tired than usual, her hand lingering against her stomach a little too often. I insisted we see a doctor, and that's when we sat in Julian Cross's office. He looked at us with rehearsed sympathy, his voice steady as he delivered the words that would rip our world apart. Stage 3 ovarian cancer? I felt the ground slip beneath me. Clara gripped my hand, her nails biting into my skin as tears streamed down her cheeks. My own voice cracked when I leaned close and whispered, "By any means necessary, I'll save you. I swear." She wept into my chest, and in that moment, I meant every word. But something about Cross unsettled me. When he introduced himself, I realized he had once been part of Clara's circle in college. She brushed it off with a casual smile, saying it was nothing more than coincidence, but a knot tightened in my stomach. When treatment began, I expected to be at her side through every step. Instead, Clara started urging me to stay home or go to work, insisting she didn't want me to see her in such a vulnerable state. "It's enough that you're providing. I don't need you watching me fall apart," she'd say. I told myself it was her pride, her way of keeping some dignity, but it left me uneasy. And then there were the phone calls. Late at night, when she thought I was asleep, I'd hear her voice in the hallway, hushed and tense. Once, when I asked, she told me it was her sister, but her sister lived 3 time zones away, and the clock on my nightstand read past midnight. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, convincing myself I was imagining things. Still, the doubt lingered. Even then, I wanted to believe the woman I loved simply needed saving, not that she might already be slipping away from me in ways I couldn't yet see. The bills came faster than I could open them. Insurance barely scratched the surface, and every envelope felt heavier than the last. I sold my father's old fishing boat, a piece of him I had sworn never to part with. The machines at the job site, trucks, saws, even the crane I had saved years to buy were listed for sale one by one. Each handshake with a buyer felt like letting go of my future. The company couldn't survive without its backbone. Projects fell apart, contracts dissolved, and soon I was standing in front of the men who had worked beside me for years, telling them I could no longer pay their wages. They left with quiet nods, their disappointment heavy in the air. I went home that night hollow, wondering how much more I could give before nothing was left. Mike, my closest friend on the crew, lingered after the others. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Ethan, something's off. Clara isn't the same. You've got to be careful." His words hit me like a warning bell, but I shoved it aside. Clara was sick, fragile, and clinging to me like a lifeline. How could I doubt her? At home, she played her part with tears and trembling hands. She told me she couldn't stand the thought of leaving Noah and Emily without a mother, and each sob twisted deeper into my resolve. I told myself I'd give anything, even if it meant breaking myself in the process. And yet, no matter how much I sacrificed, it was never enough. Clara began pressing harder, urging me to find more, her voice sharper each time. I had already emptied bank accounts, sold our home's future, dismantled the very business that defined me. But still, she looked at me with desperate eyes, demanding more. By then, I was exhausted, my spirit worn to the bone. I didn't know it yet, but what I thought was saving her life was already destroying mine. The harder I worked, the further Clara drifted from me. I picked up day jobs, hauling lumber, pouring concrete, anything that would bring in a few more dollars. Each night I came home bone-teared, only to find her face lit by the glow of her phone, her lips curling into small, secret smiles. When I asked, she brushed it aside with a careless laugh. Just messages from her support group. She said, not long after, the test results came back, and to my astonishment, the doctors called it a miracle. The cancer was shrinking at a pace that defied expectation. Relief should have overwhelmed me, yet instead of joy, unease crept in. Something about the sudden turnaround didn't feel right, though I forced myself to be grateful. Then came the changes. Clara began ordering perfumes that cost more than our weekly groceries, slipping into yoga classes at a studio in the upscale district, and arriving home with bags of expensive creams and cosmetics. I stared at the receipts in disbelief while counting the few bills I had left after selling the last work truck from my company. When I handed her money scraped together from pawning my tools, I waited for her to smile, to hug me the way she once did. Instead, she glanced at the bills, tucked them into her purse, and turned away without a word. Gratitude had vanished. In her eyes, I wasn't her savior anymore. I was her burden. The night Julian Cross told us Clara was in full remission should have been a night of celebration. Instead, it was the night she drove the blade straight through me. Clara stood in the kitchen, her face set like stone, and said flatly, "Ethan, I want a real man, not you." The words gutted me. I had sold everything, broken myself piece by piece to keep her alive. Before I could speak, she delivered another blow. She wasn't alone. Clara admitted she had been seeing Richard Coleman, a high-profile divorce attorney, and the two of them already had plans for their future. My mouth went dry, my chest burned, but before I could form a word, she reached into her bag and pulled out a manila envelope. Divorce papers. She slid them across the table with the same indifference you'd use for a bill. "I'll take full custody of the kids," she said coolly. "Richard and I can give them a better life." I stared at her, stunned into silence. Everything I had sacrificed was reduced to nothing more than her stepping stone. Then she twisted the knife one last time, her eyes glinting with contempt. "This marriage died the day you sold the house." The house I had built with my own hands, the symbol of our love, was now her proof that I was never enough. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and cold judgment. I sat in my only suit, its seams worn thin from funerals and weddings, while across the aisle Clara looked radiant in a designer dress. Beside her sat Richard Coleman, his tailored suit crisp, his smirk sharp enough to cut. He leaned back in his chair as if he'd already won. When Clara took the stand, she transformed into the perfect victim. Tears slid down her cheeks as she spoke of my instability, painting me as a man who could no longer provide, a husband too broken to be trusted. Each word landed like a hammer on my chest. Then they brought in my children. Noah couldn't look at me, his eyes fixed on the floor, jaw clenched tight. Emily's hands shook as she whispered she wanted to live with her mother. I knew those words weren't hers. They were Clara's, drilled into her like a script, but it didn't matter. The judge's pen scratched across the page, sealing my fate. Coleman stood, waving documents that showed the collapse of my business, the sales of every tool, every truck, every piece of property. He described me not as a man who sacrificed, but as one who squandered. In that sterile room, stripped of dignity, I had no defense left. The judge's voice was final and merciless. Clara would have full custody. I would see my children only under supervision, and despite being penniless, I was ordered to pay monthly support. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself, because in that moment, it felt as though I had already been buried alive. When I walked out of the courthouse, the Nashville sky opened up in sheets of rain. Clara slipped into her sleek black car, Richard at her side, their umbrellas shielding them from the storm. I had nothing but a cardboard box of papers and the clothes on my back. That night, I checked into a rundown motel on the edge of the city. The room reeked of mold, the wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the mattress sagged in the middle. I set the single photograph of my family on the cracked dresser and stared at it until my vision blurred. Days bled together. I hauled lumber at a riverfront yard for $50 a shift. My hands blistered raw. Dinner was cold canned soup or cheap noodles eaten in silence. Each night, the room seemed smaller, pressing in on me with the weight of failure. One afternoon, passing by the high school, I saw Noah shooting hoops and Emily walking toward the auditorium with her violin. My heart leapt. But the moment they saw me, Clara's hand gripped their shoulders and yanked them away. Their eyes flickered with fear. Not for themselves, but for me. News spread quickly in a town like ours. Clara and Richard had moved into a sprawling home in Belle Meade, one of Nashville's wealthiest neighborhoods. People spoke of them as a power couple, admired and envied. Every mention was another nail driven deeper into me. Then, one bitterly cold night, as I sat alone over a styrofoam cup of noodles, there came a knock at my door. The clock read 2 deo, ma'am. I opened it to find a man in a long black coat, rain dripping from his brimmed hat. His eyes were sharp, steady. "My name is Marcus Ellison," he said, his voice low but certain. "I have the truth you've been searching for." The motel room smelled of damp plaster and stale smoke when Marcus Ellison laid his leather case on the wobbly table. He opened it with deliberate care, pulling out files that looked far too thick to belong to a man's private life. And yet, every page inside carried the weight of mine. He spoke calmly, but each word shattered something inside me. Clara had never been sick, not once. The entire diagnosis was fabricated by Julian Cross, the old college acquaintance who had been far too eager to step back into her life. Every scan, every medical record, it was all manufactured, a performance staged so perfectly, I had bled myself dry believing it. Then came the bank statements. Every time I had sold something, my father's boat, the company trucks, the last of my tools, the money hadn't gone toward treatment. It had been funneled into a hidden offshore account, Clara's private escape fund. Marcus slid a small recorder across the table. He pressed play, and I heard Clara's voice, cold and mocking. The marriage died the day he sold the house. He actually cried pawning his wedding ring. Pathetic. Richard Coleman's laugh followed, sharp and cruel, a sound that made my blood boil. But the final blow came softer. Marcus told me my family had never stopped fighting for me. My father had bought back our house under a shell company, keeping it safe until I could return. My brother had tracked transactions. My mother had gathered scraps of evidence. I thought I'd been abandoned, but in truth, they had been holding me up all along, waiting for the moment to tear down the lie that had almost destroyed me. The following days unfolded like a storm, tearing through everything false and rotten. Marcus coordinated with the FBI, and by dawn one morning, Clara, Richard Coleman, and Julian Cross were led away in handcuffs. The charges stacked against them read like a nightmare. Insurance fraud, medical fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, and calculated attempts to strip me of everything I'd built. For months I had lived as if I were the failure, but in that moment, the world finally saw who the real criminals were. News traveled quickly. I watched on a small television in Marcus's office as the arrests made the evening broadcast. Coleman, once the smug, polished attorney plastered on every Nashville billboard, now kept his head down as cameras flashed. Julian Cross, the so-called healer, lost his license on the spot, and Clara, my wife of 2 decades, was shown being escorted into a federal vehicle, her eyes cold, lips pressed tight, no hint of the tears she once shed so easily when she needed my money. The heaviest moment came when Noah and Emily learned the truth. My son's voice broke as he confessed. Mom made us say those things in court. She said she'd send us away if we didn't. Emily clung to me, her small frame shaking as she sobbed. We're sorry. Dad, we didn't want to hurt you. I held them both, feeling their tears soak into my shirt, and for the first time in what felt like years, I believed I hadn't lost them after all. When I walked back up the steps of my old house, the one I thought I had sacrificed forever, my chest tightened. The porch creaked under my boots, but before I could open the door, familiar faces emerged from the shadows. My old crew, men who had swung hammers beside me, who had stood in the rain pouring foundations, were waiting there. We turned down steady jobs, boss, Mike said with a crooked grin. We knew you'd come back. I stepped inside and breathed in the scent of wood and dust, the place that once defined me. It was still mine, because my father had believed in me when I no longer did. Clara was behind bars, Coleman ruined, Cross disgraced. I had my children back. I had my house back. And most of all, I had my name back. 6 months later, the sound of saws and hammers filled the air again. But this time, it wasn't for strangers. It was for home. I stood in my rebuilt workshop, the scent of fresh-cut wood reminding me of who I once was and who I had become. Beside me, Noah measured boards with a steady hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. Emily sanded the edges of a chair leg, humming softly under her breath, preparing a gift for their grandparents. Watching them work filled me with a quiet pride that no court, no betrayal, no false sickness could ever steal from me again. On the far wall hung a single item out of place among the tools, a tarnished motel key, stamped with the number 107. I'd kept it as a reminder, not of failure, but of rebirth. That cramped, mildew-stained room had been my rock bottom. Now, it was proof that even from the lowest point, a man can rise again if he refuses to stay down. One afternoon, the phone rang. A man's voice, strained with desperation, poured through the line. His wife, he said, had been diagnosed with something rare. She was pushing him to sell their home to cover treatments, and something about it didn't sit right. Marcus had given him my number. He asked if I would take a look at the paperwork. I stared at the motel key for a long moment before answering. Bring everything you have, I told him. I'll help you. Because if the pain I carried could spare someone else the same devastation, then maybe it wasn't wasted at all. As the sun slanted through the workshop windows, I leaned against the workbench, watching my kids laugh together. I thought about the lies that had almost destroyed us, and the truth that had brought us back. I thought about my father's quiet faith, my brother's loyalty, and my crew's steadfast belief that I would return. Real strength, I realized, isn't about never falling. It's about the hands that lift you when you do. It's about the family that refuses to let go, even when you've given up on yourself. And it's about standing tall again, scarred but unbroken, knowing that no matter what comes, I am not alone.